178 cardinals sat in silence inside the Paul VI Hall. Pope Leo XIV stood at the front. He looked at them slowly, one by one. Then he leaned into the microphone and said, just 3 words. And every single cardinal in that room turned pale. What happened next inside the Vatican on June 26, 2026, was never supposed to leave those walls. The cardinals had been sworn to confidentiality. No statements to the press, no leaks, no recordings. But secrets do not survive when 178 men carry them home to churches on 6 continents. Pieces of the story began surfacing within hours, and what emerged is one of the most intense, most consequential moments in the modern history of the Catholic Church. A moment that cardinals who were there describe in only 2 ways: either the day the Church was saved or the day everything became irreversible. It started the night before. On June 25th, the eve of the extraordinary consistory, something unusual happened inside the Apostolic Palace. Pope Leo XIV cancelled his entire evening schedule. No dinner with advisors, no phone calls with diplomats, no briefings from the Secretariat of State. His personal secretary, a young Augustinian priest who had served him since his missionary days in Peru, noticed the Pope sitting alone in his private study. The lights were low, the windows were closed despite the Roman heat, and a single manila folder sat open on the desk. Thick, worn at the edges, filled with documents that had been printed on plain paper with no Vatican letterhead. The Pope did not move for nearly 2 hours. He simply read, page after page after page. His expression did not change. His breathing stayed even. But his hands tightened with every page he turned. And when he finally closed the folder, he pressed both palms flat against the desk, exhaled slowly through his nose, and said one word. Enough. His secretary asked if he needed anything. Leo shook his head. Then he said something his secretary would later describe as the most chilling sentence he had ever heard from the Pope. Tomorrow, Leo said, they will understand that the shepherd knows his flock, all of it. Before we continue with the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps more people discover what is really happening inside the Vatican. That folder had arrived 48 hours earlier. It was hand-delivered to the Pope's private residence by a Vatican official whose identity has not been publicly confirmed. No appointment was logged. No record exists of the visit. What is known is that the material came from deep inside the Secretariat of State, from someone who had been quietly gathering information for over 6 months, photocopied bank statements, screenshots of encrypted messages, internal memos marked confidential that were supposed to have been destroyed, private letters exchanged between senior cardinals that discussed, in explicit terms, strategies to delay, dilute, or outright block the Pope's reform agenda. And at the center of it all, a pattern, not random acts of disagreement, not organic theological resistance, a network, coordinated, funded, and stretching across 3 continents. This was not the kind of opposition any pope expects. This was not cardinals privately grumbling over wine about changes they did not like. This was organized sabotage disguised as institutional caution. And it had been operating right under Leo's nose since the first months of his papacy. Pope Leo XIV had known from day one that his pontificate would be unlike any other. He was the first American pope in history, the first Augustinian to lead the Church in centuries. A man born in Chicago, raised in the suburb of Dalton, educated at Villanova, trained in canon law in Rome, and shaped by decades of missionary work in some of Peru's poorest communities. He spoke 5 languages. He had governed the Augustinian order worldwide for 12 years. He understood both the marble corridors of the Vatican and the mud roads of Chulucanas. The cardinals had chosen him precisely because he was different, because Pope Francis, whose death on April 21, 2025, had left the Church in a moment of both grief and anticipation, had spent his entire pontificate pushing for a more open, more accountable, more missionary Church. And the cardinals, in choosing Robert Francis Prevost on May 8, 2025, were signaling that they wanted that mission to continue. But wanting reform and accepting reform are 2 very different things. In the 13 months since his election, Leo had moved fast. He signed his first encyclical Magnificat Humanitas on May 15, 2026, a sweeping document that challenged the unchecked rise of artificial intelligence and defended the dignity of human labor and human connection. He launched a 3-year implementation plan for the Synod on Synodality. He traveled to Turkey, Lebanon, and Algeria, meeting with Muslim leaders and Christian communities in places where the Church's voice had grown faint. He spoke out against the war in Iran, publicly calling Donald Trump's threats against Iranian civilization truly unacceptable, a statement that earned him a furious response on Truth Social, where Trump called him weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. And inside the Vatican, Leo had begun quietly restructuring how the Curia operated. More meetings documented, more financial oversight, fewer decisions made in shadow. He had convened the first extraordinary consistory in January 2026, gathering 170 cardinals for a discussion that many described as groundbreaking. At the close of that meeting, he told the cardinals something that now carried a different weight. "I feel and experience the need to be able to count on you." But what he found in that folder showed him that counting on some of them had been a mistake. The morning of June 26th arrived hot and heavy over Rome. A haze hung over the Tiber. By 7 o'clock, cardinals from every continent were already moving through the corridors of St. Peter's Basilica. Red vestments against ancient stone, hushed voices echoing through arched hallways. The Mass that opened the consistory was solemn and beautiful. The hymn Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Creator Spirit, filled the basilica. Leo stood at the altar, composed and steady. He spoke about the vine and the branches, about Christ as the center, about the need for peace in unity. But those closest to him noticed something different. His eyes were sharper than usual. His pauses were longer. There was a density behind every word that went beyond the liturgical text. One Monsignor who served at the altar would later say, "It felt like he was speaking to specific people, not the congregation, specific people." After Mass, the cardinals moved to the Paul VI Hall. The setup was deliberate and carefully designed. 20 round tables arranged across the vast space. Small groups, each table carefully composed, a mix of continents, languages, perspectives. 9 tables for cardinal electors who served as ordinaries, 11 tables for curial cardinals and non-electors over 80. This was the synodal method Leo preferred, not grand speeches delivered from on high, not the old format where one man talked and everyone else listened. This was conversation, encounter, listening. At least, that was what it was supposed to be. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, opened the session. He spoke briefly about the purpose of the gathering, the state of the world, wars raging across continents, the pursuit of peace, the ongoing implementation of the Synod. Then he introduced the Pope for his opening intervention. Leo stood from his chair. He walked to the podium with the unhurried step of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. He adjusted the microphone slightly downward. He placed both hands on the edges of the podium. And then he did something that made every cardinal in the room sit up. He paused. For a long time. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The silence stretched until it became a living thing in the room, pressing against the walls, filling the spaces between the round tables. Cardinals exchanged glances. Some looked down at their folders. Others clasped their hands. A few coughed nervously. The tension was thick enough to touch, and then Leo spoke. "I know everything." 3 words, spoken quietly, almost gently, not shouted, not dramatic, just stated. The way a man states a fact. The sky is blue, water is wet. I know everything. He said nothing else for several seconds. He just let those words hang in the air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The reaction was immediate, but it was not loud. It was not the kind of dramatic gasping you see in films. It was worse. It was the silence of men who suddenly realized they had been seen. It was the micro-movements of guilt. A cardinal reaching for his glass of water with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. Another cardinal crossing his arms tightly across his chest. A third pressing his lips together so hard they lost their color. Two cardinals at the same table, men who had served the Church for a combined 70 years, looked at each other with expressions that could only be described as fear. Then Leo continued, slowly, deliberately, every word chosen with surgical precision. He told the cardinals that the Church stood at a crossroads unlike any in modern history, that the mission of evangelization could not move forward if the institution itself was working against its own message. That unity did not mean the absence of disagreement. Unity meant the courage to be honest, even when honesty was painful, especially when honesty was painful. "I did not call you here to lecture you," he said. "I called you here because I need you. I said it in January and I meant it. But I also called you here because some of you have been working against the very mission you swore to serve, and that cannot continue." The room temperature seemed to drop. A cardinal from East Africa leaned forward in his chair. A European cardinal stared at the table surface, as though hoping it might open up and swallow him. An American cardinal blinked rapidly and then looked away. Leo did not name names. He did not need to. The devastation of what he said was not in the accusation itself. It was in the ambiguity. Every cardinal who had participated in any form of resistance, blocking reform proposals in committee, leaking confidential discussions to sympathetic journalists, redirecting discretionary funds without authorization, coordinating with external groups to undermine papal authority, was now sitting in that room, asking himself a single terrifying question: does he know about me specifically? And what happened next over the following hours proved the answer was yes. During the first working session, the cardinals discussed the pre-distributed question: in what kind of world are we called to proclaim the gospel? Cardinal Grzegorz Reich of Krakow offered a biblical meditation. Then the groups talked among themselves. Silence, prayer, sharing, reports, standard synodal procedure, normal, expected. But during this session, Leo did something unusual. Instead of remaining at his place, he walked between the tables, slowly, stopping at each group, listening, nodding, asking follow-up questions. At most tables, the exchanges were warm, collegial, productive. But at 3 specific tables, Leo leaned in close enough that only the 4 or 5 cardinals at that table could hear, and whispered something. What he whispered was different at each table. At the first, he mentioned a specific financial transfer made through an intermediary account registered in Luxembourg in February 2026. He cited the exact amount. The cardinal whose name was on the authorization went rigid. At the second table, Leo referenced a private letter sent to a conservative Catholic media outlet in April, a letter that contained verbatim quotes from a confidential papal meeting. He described the envelope. The cardinal who had sent it stopped breathing. At the third table, Leo named a dinner that had taken place at a Roman restaurant in March. The name of the restaurant, the date, the 4 cardinals who attended, and the representative of a traditionalist organization who joined them for dessert. These were not guesses. These were not rumors. These were facts delivered with the quiet precision of a man who had done his homework thoroughly and was finished waiting. The effect was devastating in its subtlety. At the first table, the cardinal in question excused himself to use the restroom and did not return for 20 minutes. When he came back, his face was ashen. At the second table, 2 cardinals began whispering urgently to each other until a third motioned for them to stop. At the third table, the oldest cardinal present, a man in his 80s who had served under 3 popes, closed his eyes and clasped his hands together as though in prayer. Perhaps it was prayer. Perhaps it was something else entirely. But here is what nobody expected. Leo did not confront these cardinals publicly. He did not humiliate them. He whispered. He kept it private. He gave them dignity even as he stripped away their secrecy. And that, in many ways, was more terrifying than any public accusation could have been, because it meant this was not a performance. This was a warning. By the afternoon session, the atmosphere in the Paul VI Hall had completely transformed. The official theme was the culture of power and the civilization of love, introduced by Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, drawing from Chapter 5 of Magnifica Humanitas. But the real conversation was happening in the margins. During the coffee break, small clusters of cardinals gathered in the corridors outside the hall. The whispering was intense. Some were afraid. Some were angry. Some were calculating their next move. And a significant number, the ones who had spent years frustrated by the invisible resistance they could sense but never prove, were experiencing something like relief. Because not all of them were complicit. The majority of the 178 cardinals present were good men doing their best in an impossibly complex institution. They had watched reform proposals mysteriously stall. They had seen budgets redirected without transparent justification. They had heard whispers about organized opposition, but had no evidence. Now the Pope had signaled that he had the evidence. And for those who genuinely believed in the mission of the Church, this was a breakthrough. But what happened next during the open dialogue almost shattered the entire moment. When the floor was opened for direct questions and free interventions, limited to 3 minutes per cardinal, Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller stood up. Müller, the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was known for his intellectual precision and his willingness to speak bluntly. He had already told journalists that morning that many cardinals preferred open plenary debates over the synodal small table format. He was not a man who accepted ambiguity well. He looked directly at the Pope and said, in a measured but unmistakably firm tone, that the suggestion of organized resistance was a grave accusation that required evidence, not atmosphere. He said that if the Pope possessed proof of wrongdoing, he had a canonical obligation to present it through proper institutional channels, not through theatrical gestures in a plenary session. He said the dignity of the College of Cardinals was at stake. The hall went completely silent. Every eye moved from Müller to the Pope. This was a direct challenge, not to Leo's authority in the abstract, but to his method, to his judgment. And every cardinal in the room understood that how Leo responded in the next 60 seconds would define the character of the rest of his papacy. Leo listened without any visible reaction. When Müller finished, the Pope waited 3 full seconds, a pause that felt like 30, and then nodded once. "Cardinal Müller," he said, "you are right that clarity matters. So let me be clear. I am not making accusations in this hall. I am offering an invitation. The invitation is simple. Come to me, tell me the truth, and we will find a way forward together. But if anyone chooses silence over honesty, I want them to know, I want every person in this room to know, that I will not look away. This Church will not hide anymore." A wave of quiet applause moved through the room, not thunderous, not unanimous, but present, real, and deeply significant. Because in that moment, Leo had performed an act of extraordinary leadership. He had taken a direct challenge, absorbed it without defensiveness, and turned a confrontation into an open door. He had been firm without being cruel, authoritative without being authoritarian, and he had done it all in under 30 seconds. Müller sat down. He did not applaud, but he also did not object further, and that silence, from a man not known for silence, said more than any speech could have. What many people did not see was what happened immediately after. As the session broke for a brief pause, Cardinal Raymond Burke, the conservative American cardinal who had been seated at the same round table as Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe, a deliberate pairing that itself had raised eyebrows, approached Müller in the corridor. They spoke for less than a minute. Their voices were low, but their body language was intense. Burke gestured twice toward the hall. Müller shook his head. Then they parted without another word. No one knows what was said. But whatever it was, neither man spoke publicly for the rest of the consistory. The evening brought another shift. After the session concluded with the singing of the Te Deum, the cardinals were invited to dinner with the Pope in the Paul VI Hall. It was meant as a moment of fraternity, wine from the papal cellars, warm bread, conversation. On the surface, it functioned. Smiles were exchanged, stories were told. Laughter happened even if it was a bit too careful. But beneath the surface, something else was unfolding. 3 cardinals requested private meetings with the Pope that night, not through official channels, through his personal secretary. Each request came within the same hour. Each asked for absolute discretion. Each said the matter was urgent. And each one, when they sat down with Leo later that night in his private study, on the third floor of the Apostolic Palace, said the same thing. I want to tell you what I know. The first was a cardinal from South America. He had been pressured for months to block a reform proposal on financial transparency in diocesan operations, not through official channels, through intermediaries, men in expensive suits who arrived at his residence in Buenos Aires without appointments and spoke in careful euphemisms about maintaining stability and protecting traditional donor relationships. He had been told, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that influential Catholic foundations in Europe and North America would withdraw their financial support if the reform passed. He named the intermediary who delivered the pressure. He named the cardinal who authorized it. And he handed Leo a USB drive containing recorded phone calls he had made without the other party's knowledge. It was a violation of protocol. It was also the bravest thing he had ever done. The second was a European cardinal who had stumbled onto something while reviewing communication logs in his own dicastery. Internal messages from the January consistory, discussions that had been explicitly classified as confidential, had been selectively forwarded to a conservative Catholic media outlet within hours of the session ending. Not the full conversations, just the parts that could be taken out of context, just the fragments that, if published without explanation, would make the Pope look indecisive or divided from his cardinals. The European cardinal had traced the leak to a specific office within the Curia. He brought printouts, server timestamps, email routing headers. He had been afraid to come forward for 5 months because the person responsible was under the direct protection of a senior curial figure, someone powerful enough to end a career with a single phone call. The third was an African cardinal who revealed something that chilled even Leo. He had been approached by representatives of the Society of St. Pius X, the traditionalist group that was planning to consecrate 4 bishops without papal consent on July 1st, just 4 days away. They had asked him to quietly express support for their position, arguing that Leo's reforms were eroding the liturgical and doctrinal tradition of the Church. He had refused, but he knew of at least 2 other cardinals who had not refused. 2 cardinals who had privately signaled sympathy with the SSPX's cause. 2 men who sat in this very consistory and listened to the Pope talk about unity while quietly cheering its destruction. Leo listened to each of the 3 without interruption. He took no notes. He asked no questions until they were done. And when each finished, he said the same thing. "Thank you for your courage. Now let me show you mine." He told them what he had been doing. The folder was not a surprise to him. He had been expecting it. He had in fact been building a parallel investigation for the past 8 months, not through the traditional Vatican channels, which he knew were compromised, but through a small, hand-picked group of canon lawyers and financial auditors who reported to no one except him. People chosen for their integrity, not their connections. The folder simply confirmed what his team had already assembled. The network of resistance was real and structured around 3 pillars. The first was financial, curial officials redirecting discretionary funds to support organizations and media outlets that opposed the papal reform agenda. The second was informational, a systematic pattern of leaking confidential papal communications to journalists who could be relied upon to spin them negatively. The third was ecclesiastical, a small group of cardinals coordinating with bishops and religious leaders outside Rome to slow or block the implementation of reforms at the local level, using theological objections as cover for what was really about institutional self-preservation and power. Leo had names, dates, documents, wire transfers, everything. On the second morning, June 27th, Leo changed the agenda. Cardinal Mario Grech was supposed to open with a presentation on synodality. Instead, Leo asked for the floor. He stood before the assembled cardinals and spoke for 12 uninterrupted minutes. It was the most personal address of his papacy. He talked about Peru, about the years he spent in Chulucanas, watching communities survive on almost nothing while institutional structures consumed resources meant for them. About the moment he understood that the greatest threat to the Church was not persecution from outside, but decay from within. About Francis, who trusted the cardinals to carry his vision forward. Then he said something that would be printed on the front page of every major newspaper in the world within 24 hours. "Francis trusted you. I want to trust you too. But trust is not given. It is built. And some of you have been tearing it down." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, every ripple visible, every face changed. And then he made his move. 3 announcements, delivered back to back, each one more significant than the last. First, every dicastery of the Roman Curia would undergo an independent financial review within 60 days, not conducted by Vatican personnel, not overseen by curial officials, but by an external team of international auditors, selected by the Pope personally. 3 years of transactions, all discretionary spending, all donations received and distributed, every account, everything. Second, a new whistleblower protection office would be created, reporting directly to the Pope. Any priest, bishop, cardinal, or lay employee who reported corruption, abuse, or institutional misconduct would be guaranteed protection from retaliation. The office would operate with full independence and the authority to refer cases to both canonical and civil jurisdictions. Third, he addressed the SSPX directly. The Society of St. Pius X, the traditionalist group founded in 1970 in opposition to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, was planning to consecrate 4 new bishops without papal consent on July 1st, just 4 days away. It would be the most significant act of ecclesiastical defiance since Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's original consecrations in 1988, which had resulted in automatic excommunication. The SSPX had even sent what they called a profession of faith to Leo and every cardinal in the world, insisting that their traditionalist approach was the only answer to what they called the chief errors of our time. They were planning a 4-day live-streamed event at their Swiss seminary. They were selling commemorative wine sets. They were not hiding. They were celebrating. Leo said he had sent a personal letter to their leadership urging reconsideration. The door to dialogue remained open. He would always keep that door open. But then his voice changed. It dropped lower. It slowed. And he said that any cardinal or bishop who had privately encouraged, supported, or expressed sympathy with the SSPX's schismatic actions would face canonical consequences. Not hypothetical consequences, real ones, investigated, documented, and enforced. "Truth is not negotiable," he said, "and neither is the unity of this church." The consistory continued through its final sessions. The small group discussions were more intense and honest than any in recent memory. The culture of silence that had defined Vatican politics for decades was cracking. Not broken, not yet, but audibly cracking. By the evening of June 27th, 7 additional cardinals had requested private audiences with the Pope. Some came to confess involvement in the resistance network. Some came to offer information they had been too afraid to share. 2 came simply to ask for forgiveness. Leo met with each one individually. He listened, he forgave. But he made clear that forgiveness and accountability were not opposites. They were partners. One cardinal, a man in his 70s who had served in the Curia for over 2 decades, reportedly wept during his meeting, not from shame, from relief. He said he had been carrying the secret of what he knew for over a year, and the weight of it had been destroying him from inside. Leo placed his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "The truth does not destroy us. Hiding from it does." In his closing remarks to the full consistory on June 27th, Pope Leo told the assembled cardinals that what mattered was not how many meetings they held, but the quality of honesty those meetings contained. "Synodality is not a series of meetings," he said. "It is a spiritual style. It arises from encounter, grows through listening, and matures through discernment." He announced he would reveal the date of the next consistory later in the year, and he said something else that stayed with every man in the room. "During these days we have sought the Lord's will together." Seeing cardinals from such diverse churches, cultures, and situations listening to one another has been a source of consolation and hope for me. But everyone understood the subtext. Consolation, yes, but also warning. Hope, yes, but also a deadline. The time for games was ending. Cardinal Jean-Paul Vesco of Algiers would later tell reporters something simple but profound. For years and years, the cardinals did not know each other. Now we are starting to. And that changes everything. But behind the official statements and press releases, the real change was deeper. Pope Leo XIV had walked into that consistory carrying a burden that would have crushed most leaders. The knowledge that the very people entrusted with helping him lead the Church were actively undermining it from within. And instead of responding with rage or retribution, he responded with something far more powerful. He responded with truth, delivered quietly, without theatrics, without malice, just truth. 3 words. I know everything. That was all it took. Not because the words themselves held magical power, but because the man who said them meant every syllable. And in a world drowning in spin and calculation and carefully managed ambiguity, a leader who simply tells the truth, fully, directly, without flinching, is the most dangerous force there is. The reforms Leo announced would take months to implement. The financial reviews would uncover things that shocked even his closest advisors. The whistleblower office would receive its first reports within weeks of opening. And the relationship between the Pope and the College of Cardinals would never go back to what it was before June 26, 2026. But all of that was still ahead. On the evening of June 27th, as the last cardinals filed out of the Paul VI Hall, as the round tables were cleared and the microphones switched off and the lights dimmed to a warm amber glow, Pope Leo XIV stood alone for a moment in the empty room. He looked up at the high ceiling. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days the weight on his shoulders felt lighter, not gone, lighter. He had done what he came to do. He had looked into the eyes of 178 men and told them the truth. Some had listened, some had not yet, but the message had been delivered, and it could not be undelivered. In the silence of that empty hall, Robert Francis Prevost, the kid from Chicago's South Side who became a friar, a missionary, a bishop, a cardinal, and then the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics, allowed himself one quiet moment. Just one. Then he straightened his white cassock, turned toward the door, and walked back to the Apostolic Palace. Because the Church does not wait. The world does not wait. And a pope who means what he says can never afford to stop. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Every like, every share, every comment helps us keep bringing these stories to light. Stay with us. The story of Pope Leo XIV is far from over.